This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 104. Do high mortgages slow growth?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, well, most of us have heftier mortgages these days. In the UK, we owe about £1.4 trillion to pay off our homes. In 1999, it was less than £500 million, so it's trebled in less than 2 decades, 5 times the rate of inflation. And we pay out about £19 billion a month on mortgage repayments. So what's happening to that money? Is it still working its magic to keep the economy going, or does it slow things down? We'll look at that today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, I've always been told that house prices help contribute to the growth of a country, that if house prices are going well, then the country's going well, which I've always thought is a bit strange because it's not a particularly productive element of the country, is it really, and the economy? Because, you know, you buy a house to live in. There's only a certain number of people in the country, so you only need a house each at best. So if prices are going up more than inflation, then that's not because the economy is becoming more productive. It's because developers and homeowners know that they can get away with charging you more. So, Steve, I mean, why would we even think that house prices in any way contributed to the health of an economy? I think it was the other way around, isn't it?
Well, this is my position. I mean, houses are basically a consumption item, not a investment item. Because one little simple reason: it's illegal to sell your children.
Really? Damn it!
So factories produce output which you can actually flog and make a profit out of. If you flog, pardon, I won't take that joke too far. But if you do the same, you can't do the same with housing. Housing is a place you live in. You're not going to be selling any output from your house. So to value it as an asset in the same sense we value a factory, I think is misleading to begin with. That's what we've got caught up with because, of course, to buy a house, you have to borrow money. Now, the trap when you borrow money is the borrowing money itself causes a feedback that actually drives up the house prices. And what you get out of that is if you've bought the house and you're leaving your position to buy the house, you need back on the what I would regard these days as the good old days when you had to have a 30% deposit to buy a house. Then if the house price was $1 million and you put down a $300,000 deposit and the price goes up by 30%, in a notional sense, you've doubled your money because you put in $300,000, it's now worth $1.3 million. You can sell it for a $600,000 profit once you pay off the debt. And that's what got us caught up in the whole trap of seeing house prices as a productive asset rather than as a place to live. The thing is, of course, it's only productive if the price rises. It's because you're not selling anything in the house itself. You're just selling the house in toto.
But the question is, why would that happen? Why would that house go from 1 million to 1.3 million? Why wouldn't it just be going up in line with inflation? In which case you'd be saying, there's no benefit from doing this because it's just the same as putting that money in in an interest-bearing account, for example, or something which is more linked to the rate of inflation.
Well, there's 2 elements to it. One is the one that the Georgists always focus upon, and that is the idea that when you buy a house, you're not just buying a property, you're buying its location. And its locations and the value of it depends upon the location, not just in terms of what you've done to improve the property, but also what society itself does to improve the property. So my favourite example in the UK is the Queen Elizabeth. Is it the Queen Elizabeth line or QE2 subway line going through?
The Elizabeth line.
Okay. Each time, when each new tube station opens up on the line that's following, the houses in the local area will go up in value because suddenly you're close to a tube station when that wasn't the case beforehand. And that becomes a transportation, a socially paid for way in which your value of your property has risen. So if you
sure. And we've spoken about that before, and you get the benefits out of that. But I mean, that doesn't apply if you've got a house in the wilds of Scotland, for example, or in lots of places where there's not a lot of infrastructure being added. We're still seeing house prices increase. And, and that is, getting back to the original question, that's seen as being a good thing, but it's not. I mean, it really doesn't influence the economy one way or the other, does it?
Well, it does in one sense if it actually encourages more construction development, which is, again, another circular argument. But the argument economists have always made in favour of the good side of rising values of assets. They believe what is called a wealth effect. And this is a major part of the argument in favour of QE when it was first taken on as well, quantitative easing. What the people spend, not just on the basis of their income, but also on the basis of their wealth, actual or perceived wealth. and an increase in house prices was supposed to lead to people feeling wealthier and therefore consuming more. Now, we're back in all sorts of dilemmas once more on the value of higher consumption. But empirically, the US Federal Reserve has done one study where they looked at whether it is or is not a wealth effect. There is no wealth effect from shares. They couldn't find any whatsoever. So a variation in share prices had no impact upon whether people consume more or less. There was a wealth effect with housing, but not a large one.
That is bizarre. Why the difference? I mean, they are both the same in effect, aren't they? They're something you bought that has got a value, and you can leverage that to spend it on other stuff.
No, because it's not as easy you can't get a high value out of shares unless you sell them. If you want to get a capital gain out of shares, you can't get a loan for the capital gain of the shares. You can get a loan for the capital gain of your house. So there is the whole idea of what they call that when you refinance your housing or you use the house as an ATM, there's a financial reason why that increase in the valuation can actually finance an increase in consumption. There's no such thing with shares. But of course, it's a very roundabout way to try to get a boost to demand. And why do they want to boost the demand? Because the economy is falling over. Why did the economy fall over? Because there'd been a housing bubble beforehand that burst. So we're back to the stage where it's circular reasoning rather than sensible reasoning. It's getting us in trouble here.
One thing my parents tried to pummel into me, and I'm sure it's the same for everybody else, was that you should buy a house as soon as you possibly can, because if you rent, that's dead money. And I'm wondering if that's the case, because if I rent, I pay my landlord, and that landlord then gets money that landlord can then spend buying other things. So he has that money to spend. That money keeps circulating. So that's not a drain on the economy quite so much, isn't it? Even if my rents keep getting higher and higher, I might have less money. I can afford to buy less. It just means my landlord can buy more.
But it also means, and this has been an argument for some people who are eschewing house ownership as a means to wealth. They say, well, if you actually put aside the money you'd otherwise be saving for a deposit and buy shares with it, you'll actually get a higher rate of return. And I know quite a few colleagues have taken that route over time and done very well out of it. But the thing is, it's the easiest apparent route to wealth in the Western society, particularly one with which the deregulated finances we've had for 20 or 30 years in the West, is to buy a house and watch its house price rise. And its house price rises fundamentally because of deregulated finance. So again, we're caught with the circularity. It works while the level of mortgage debt continues rising, and that's the danger that we face, that all this last 40 years of expecting house prices to rise has been driven by a higher and higher level of household debt. And looking at the American data, which I think is the most the least contaminated by impact from the rest of the world, because it is still the world's most self-contained economy. If you go back to 1980, the level of mortgage debt in America was 40% of GDP. If you fast forward to pretty much just before the 2000s, so let's 2 decades ago, it was 60% of GDP. It went from 60% to 100% over about a 10-year period. When it peaked, that was the end of rising house prices. It's then come down from 100% of GDP to about 75% of GDP. But that the rising level of mortgage debt is the fundamental cause of the rise in house prices. It looks like you're wealthier, but in fact you're not, because the source of your wealth is more debt, and debt, of course, subtracts from your wealth.
So until you get to that point where you go, oh my God, I'm carrying so much debt, I'm going to have to stop spending, and everybody else draws the same conclusion. Until you reach that point, the point in the interim where you're quite happy to borrow to pay for a heftier mortgage, are those increasing house prices that's driving that call for that heftier mortgage, is that helping the economy in any way? Is it distracting the economy? Is it slowing the economy down? Is it speeding the economy up, or is it making no difference?
It's distorting the economy entirely, because we focus upon building an asset which does not produce any value. Again, I said houses are only a productive asset if you can sell your children. And
so you're saying it's
legal,
distorting it? By saying distorting it, then you mean it's actually it's slowing the economy. People would be using their money for more productive things.
Yeah, if we weren't worrying about it. And this, again, the German attitude to housing is very, very different. And in fact, I had a friend who told me he's buying into I think somewhere around Bonn, buying a property around Bonn, and he was willing to accept the seller's asking price, because he's coming from where he was coming, which is a fairly wealthy part of the UK. That didn't look like a bad price at all. And the sale was actually stopped by the local mayor. He said, no, he's wanting too much. We'll go and tell him to drop his price by something like about 25%. And the household was actually broke. They didn't want the guy to waste his money buying a property. And again, if you look at German renting rules, this is another part of German culture that I would very happily export to the rest of the world. The rights of tenants are so good that in a German, as far as I'm understanding, almost all German leasing arrangements, when you agree to lease a house, you also agree to provide the kitchen for the house. And I don't mean the clocks and forks, I mean the whole damn thing.
It's a long-term rental.
Yeah, that's a long-term rental. And what it means is people are able to move much more easily in their location in terms of they're not locked in by a high mortgage to mean that they can't afford to leave unless they can sell their house again. It's a fairly ordinary thing to leave the house you're in and go to another one if you need to. But at the same time, when you choose somewhere to stay, the rents are relatively low. A lot of your money is left over for other activities, which is what we actually need. Things that stuff that will actually produce a higher standard of living, whether it means more growth or not, but more innovation, more investment can occur if we're spending less of our time flipping houses to each other, which are fundamentally unproductive assets.
Right, but the counter argument to that, which is often given, isn't it, by economists, is but you're still paying money to somebody else. It may be money that you're not spending on other things because you're paying a high mortgage, but you're paying it to somebody else. It goes to the previous owner, or it goes to the developer who then spends that money, or perhaps it goes to a bank, and that that makes money available for other investment, for example. Which
it doesn't, because bank.
As I was saying that, I was saying I'm just handing you this. This is a gold nugget for Steve Keen.
This is the level of business debt as a percentage of GDP pretty much peaked back in the 1980s. And my feeling is that what's been going on is that the financial sector fundamentally makes a profit for itself by creating debt. They saturated the business sector with as much debt as they could push their way until the 1987 stock market crash hit. And as soon as that market was out of the way, who else can we extend money to? And it became the household sector. And then this whole idea of rising house prices becoming a one-way bet became part of the mentality of the West in general. It still lives on in some primitive parts, like, for example, countries like, I think, Australia and Canada would qualify, though they're starting to find it's falling over on them. But this obsession with rising house prices took over then. And if you look over the very long term, and this is work of both Robert Shiller and I've forgotten the real estate economist involved, but a real estate economist looked at the world's longest price series for house prices, which happened to involve a street which is about 4 or 5 streets where I currently am, called the Herengracht Canal in Amsterdam, where the price series goes back to, I think, 1620 or something of that nature, actually even before the tulip craze over here. And over the extremely long term, there's been no trend in house prices. They go up, they go down, over periods as long as 70 years up or 50 years down. But over the long term, we pay roughly the same proportion of our income towards housing as any other good. And the whole idea that there's a necessity of rising house prices tends to coincide with a speculative bubble in lending by the financial sector.
Right. So you think what goes up will come down, and perhaps there'll be the hurt felt in the meantime. So gets back to the original question. So is a mortgage dead money? Does it slow growth? In the short term, it obviously does if we have this housing bubble happening. But even when it is happening, if I pay £1 million, crazy sum of £1 million, which is how much you have to pay to buy a decent house in England, it seems these days, certainly in the south, and then I sell it for 1.4 million. Someone's going to buy it for 1.4 million, and I've got 1.4 million. I've got a stack of cash. So it's not as though it's a. So what I'm trying to say is I keep on earning from it, and so long as I keep on earning from it, I do have cash to spend, and surely that's helping me push money out into the economy, isn't it?
And that is where the original growth came from, because it's all debt financed growth, and this is part of my work on trying to build a proper monetary model of capitalism. Is that if you look at old Milton Friedman's argument about what drives the economy, he said it's a turnover of money. So the amount of money you've got times how many times it turns over a year will be equal to the value of GDP, which you can break down into the price level times real GDP. And that's his allocation MV equals PT. When I look at the role of credit, the modification that comes out of that equation, it's a MV plus the change in debt equals P times price level times GDP. So the change in debt is actually driving up the recorded level of GDP, and that is why rising house prices appear to give you a form of prosperity, because what's causing house prices to rise is more credit. With more credit being created, the economy has a higher level of turnover, and it looks great. But the reason why economists end up encouraging this is that their own theories tell them credit plays no role in setting asset prices. Now, that is monumentally, tragically wrong when you compare it to the data. And I'm just doing a bit of work right now for marking in a Canadian PhD thesis as it happens. But if I look at the level of margin debt, so margin debt, which is used to buy shares as a percentage of GDP, and compare that to the what's called the Robert Shiller's capital cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio, which tells you whether shares are overvalued or not. The correlation between the two is supposed to be zero, effectively close to zero, not significantly different from zero, according to mainstream economic theory. There's a thing called the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis. The correlation is actually 0.72, which is closer to 1 than it is to 0. When I look at the causal mechanism, which is the change, the acceleration, or the change in new margin debt versus the change in the share price index, again, that should be not significantly different to 0 according to mainstream theory. Correlation is 0.5. And ditto, when you look at mortgage debt, the correlation between mortgage debt as percentage of GDP and the house price index is 0.9, and the correlation between change in new mortgages and change in the house price level is 0.8. So what we have is a phenomenally strong argument that all this stuff is credit-driven, is debt-driven. So ultimately, what it feels like growth of the person who sells when the bubble's going on, and therefore has somebody buying off them who took more money than they did, that is both a booming economy, and it looks like that rising house price contributes to a booming economy. But it's contributing to the DDT side of it rather than the MV times PT. And what you get out of this as well is because people are so focused on saving money to pay off their mortgage, the rate at which they turn over existing money actually goes down. And that's been the negative contributor to the value of nominal GDP in America since 1980. The rate of turnover of money has almost halved. Now,
that situation you described in Germany, where the local authority is saying no, you're paying too much for this house, is better for the economy as a whole.
Yeah, I think so.
So, we're a long way away from the rest of the world following on. Although it's interesting, isn't it? Because you think Germany is a staunchly capitalist society. It's a very successful economy. It's hell bent on manufacturing and exports. It's doing fairly well for itself for a number of reasons. And so you'd think they would be a country that lots of people would be looking at. But on this one, I suspect not.
No, they're not looking at it. And that's, to me, the one thing I do look at for Germany, say we should be copying this, is its rules on rental, which actually takes away the pressure people feel to have to get out of being a renter. I mean, if you live in Australia, which has probably got the world's worst rental terms, you can be chucked out on a whim by the landlord after the first 6-month lease is up. And you have to ask the landlord permission to put a blue tack on the wall. I mean, whereas in Germany, you can redecorate the place because by the time the next tenant comes along, it might be 15 years. And the landlord happily collects a relatively small amount of rent for a relatively low investment to buy the property in the first place. So it is a healthier economy when you don't have this obsession with house prices. By the way, in terms of velocity, I thought I'd look up the numbers. What's called money of zero velocity. It's probably the most specialized measure of money which is easily accessed money, MZM money. The velocity of MZM money in 1984 was 3.5. Its value currently is 1.3.
Wow.
So
because so much of it is tied up in housing.
I believe so. I think the large part of what's happened is the whole debt finance speculative bubble we've been through, which really had its first denouement in 1987. That has meant that people are trying to hang on to money longer to be able to pay their own debts down, which means the actual rate of turnover of money has dropped dramatically. So we've gone at the peak level is the first quarter of 1981, when the velocity of MZM money stock was 3.549. It plunged again during the Great Recession. It is currently, let's see if I get the data. Here we go, 1.3. Now, imagine the difference in out of the literally amount of economic activity out of the turnover of existing money. If we were back at the level that applied in the 1980s versus now, it'd be 2.5 times the size of the economy right now.
Wow,
it's huge.
And we could achieve that if we put some sort of limits on house prices.
Yeah, if we stop letting banks create as much debt as they want, which is what the whole deregulatory framework for the last 30 or 40 years has been about, rather than liberating the innovative side of capitalism, it's been enabling financial institutions to decide how much debt to create. The amount of debt they like to create as much as they can bloody well get away with. It's not what the economy actually needs. And I think
but how do you control that? Because if you were to say to a bank, say, you mentioned that 30% deposit figure, that was a long time ago, because I only ever remember it being 10 or 20%, I think, when in the late 80s. I think if you
I am a bit older than you, mate. Yeah.
Yeah, you are older than me. I remember if it was 20%, then you got a good, you got the best possible interest rate. If you only put 10% down, then the interest rate wasn't quite as good. So people were trying to save for a 20% deposit. Now, of course, 10% is the most you're ever going to have to pay. But if you were to say, well, okay, let's make it 30%. Let's enforce then that means lots of people just wouldn't be able to afford to ever reach that. So you'd get housing in the hands of a few. Is that necessarily going to hold the prices down?
No, what you'd do is you would have house prices being lower, because the main factor driving a house prices is mortgage debt. This again, I'm done. I've still got to finish a paper. It keeps on being put off. Paul Lombrons are going to hang, draw, and quarter me if I continue to laying our joint paper on this much longer. But the causal mechanism behind rising house prices is rising levels of new mortgage debt. So if you stop the banks being able to create as much money as they've been allowed to for mortgages, you wouldn't have the higher house prices we have now either. And that 30% deposit would be 30% of, in the case you were using, 30% of 300,000, not 30% of $1 million. No. So it'd be easier to actually save that deposit, and paying it off wouldn't be as much of a burden. So you'd be able to spend more of your money on the main street rather than taking it all down to the bank.
Yeah. All right. 30% deposit, lower house prices. We've got more money. We spend it more. It has a faster turnover. The economy increases many times more than it currently is. That's the model. That's the model,
but also to actually get there, you've got to stop banks creating money just for on collateralized lending, where they actually their lending actually causes the value of the collateral. So that's what when I talk about my modern debt jubilee, additional elements of that are to say that banks should only be allowed to lend to some multiple of the income earning capacity of whatever they're enabling you to purchase. So my rule of thumb figure has been there that the maximum bank should be able to lend is something like 10 times the annual rental income of a property. Now, going back to the property that I was renting in Waterloo until very recently, I was paying £18,000 a year to rent it. My rule would be that nobody at all, not me, not Bonnie, Prince Charles or anybody, could borrow more than $180,000 to buy, or pounds to buy it. Its price, I think I saw a price level for it as $350,000. So there's no way that its price would be $350,000 if the most you could borrow to buy it be $180,000. More likely the price would be about $200,000, $210,000, and a similar reduction would apply across house prices across the whole country. So you'd have lower house prices, but also a lower level of leverage. And in terms of people competing to buy a place, you wouldn't be competing to get more leverage. It wouldn't be possible. You'd only compete by saving more money. So you would actually get that, just a lower level of house prices, and therefore a lower level of income necessary to service it, and people having less fear about the amount of debt they've accumulated because they have less debt.
So apart from a mayor in a town in Germany, are there many government officials, many governments around the world that get this and would see? Because, these are very enforceable regulations, aren't they? We've actually got, a couple of key things that could be done there that could have a sweeping reform on the economy and can be applied sort of in a very precise way.
Yeah, I don't think it'll happen for the simple reason that politicians are so wedded to the financial sector now that anything that threatens the financial sector and threatens house prices, they will themselves block. So the only chance to do this is in the aftermath of a crisis. And the UK's crisis in house prices and the bubble level was back in 2009. America's is 2006 to 2008. Because it was stopped then, it's not going to be stopped now. In the sense that any possibility for reform was back then. Of course, it was completely blown, and they're still locked. They're still going to want to get back to the same old mechanism. The trouble is, it simply doesn't have the same elasticity anymore because people are not able to take on that additional debt.
Jeremy Corbyn might entertain the idea.
Let's hope so. But I think as soon as he did, he'd be crucified by every newspaper in the country for what he's doing to the wealth of the abolished middle class. And we'd be back on the same old sell job that's got us back into this level of private debt in the first place.
Newspapers, of course, rely on real estate advertising as well, so they've got a vested interest in keeping the prices high too, of course.
That's the other thing. Good
to talk, Steve. We'll catch you again very soon. Thank you.
Okay, mate. Yep.
So isn't that interesting? Not totally unproductive, of course. The money doesn't disappear in its entirety, but it certainly trickles around a lot slower at the moment it gets tied up in housing debt. So we need to free some of that money and get the economy kicking along. That's it for the Debunking Economics podcast this time. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll catch you again with Professor Steve Keen very soon. Thanks for listening.